The plexiglass of the cockpit shudders. 200 feet below, the Bismarck Sea is a dark, agitated blur. Major Edward Lana's hands are firm on the control column of his B-25 Mitchell, a machine that has been twisted by genius and rage into something its designers never intended. He is not flying a bomber anymore. He is aiming a 12-ton shotgun, and his target is the entire Japanese Imperial Navy. At 250 miles per hour, the world is a smear of green water and gray sky. In the distance, the silhouettes of a Japanese convoy. 16 ships, transports packed with nearly 7,000 soldiers, shielded by 8 deadly destroyers. To the men in those ships, an attacking bomber is a distant drone, a high-altitude threat to be dodged. They are about to learn, in the most violent way imaginable, that the rules have changed. Lana and his men are not coming from above. They are coming straight at them, at mast height, in a horizontal sleet of lead and explosives. Conventional military wisdom called this tactic suicide. The mathematics of survival were stacked against them. But in the desperate calculus of the Pacific War, sometimes the only path to victory is paved with impossible odds. This is not just the story of a single desperate battle. It is the story of a military revolution, born from catastrophic failure and forced into existence by a handful of mavericks who dared to defy the doctrine that was losing them the war. It's the story of how the complete annihilation of a Japanese convoy in March 1943 wasn't an accident, but the final, explosive result of a domino effect of innovation, desperation, and audacious leadership. Our central thesis is this: the Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't won by a secret weapon, but by a systematic rejection of the military rulebook, proving that in the crucible of war, the most powerful weapon isn't steel, but the will to adapt or die. To understand the revolution, you must first understand the dogma it destroyed. By 1942, the United States Army Air Forces was built around a central, almost religious belief: the doctrine of high-altitude precision daylight bombing. The high priest of this religion was a device of mythic complexity and reputation: the Norden bombsight. This was America's secret weapon. A mechanical analog computer, a breathtaking assembly of gyroscopes, gears, and telescopes that, in theory, could allow a bombardier flying at 20,000 feet to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel. The strategy was elegant, clean, and safe. American bombers, bristling with defensive machine guns, would fly in massive, self-defending formations, cruising in the thin, cold air far above the reach of most anti-aircraft fire. From this lofty sanctuary, the bombardier, a technician of destruction, would calmly guide his bombs to their targets. It was a vision of warfare as a scientific enterprise, a long-range surgical strike that promised victory with minimal risk to American aircrews. On the proving grounds in the deserts of California, it worked beautifully. Against static targets under clear blue skies, the Norden was a marvel. But the Southwest Pacific was not California. The sky was not always clear, and the targets were not static. The Japanese Empire, a sprawling maritime power, was sustained by a constant flow of ships, transports, destroyers, cruisers, that zigzagged across the vast ocean, ferrying troops and supplies to island garrisons. And against these maneuvering ships, the pickle barrel promise of the Norden bombsight was shattering into 1,000 pieces. The problem was simple physics and terrifying statistics. A bomb dropped from 10,000 feet takes nearly a minute to reach the surface. For a ship captain, a minute is an eternity. He could see the glint of the bombers far above, watch for the telltale specks detaching from their bomb bays, and then, with a hard turn of the rudder, move his vessel out of the way. The American bombardiers could only watch in frustration as their payloads, aimed with such precision, created enormous, magnificent, and utterly useless geysers of water. The numbers coming into the headquarters of Lieutenant General George Kenney, the newly appointed commander of the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, were not just bad, they were catastrophic. Throughout 1942 and into early 1943, his bombers were mounting massive efforts with almost nothing to show for it. In one attempt to interdict a Japanese convoy in January, American aircraft flew 416 separate sorties. They dropped hundreds of tons of explosives. The result? 2 enemy ships sunk, 3 damaged. It was a rate of return so abysmal that the Japanese were resupplying their garrisons in New Guinea with near impunity. For Kenney, this wasn't an abstract statistical problem. It was a crisis that was costing Allied lives every single day. Down in the malarial jungles of New Guinea, American and Australian soldiers were locked in a meat grinder campaign against a tenacious, well-supplied enemy. Every Japanese convoy that slipped through the Allied air net meant more troops, more ammunition, and more food for the soldiers fighting the diggers and GIs on the ground. The war in the Southwest Pacific was fundamentally a war of logistics, and the Allies were losing. Kenney, a pugnacious fighter pilot from the First World War, was not a man bound by doctrine. He saw a system that was failing, a strategy that was broken. The myth of high-altitude precision was being exposed as a fantasy. His men were risking their lives, flying long, arduous missions over open ocean, only to watch their bombs churn the sea. The Japanese ships, seemingly untouchable, continued their grim procession to New Guinea, strengthening the garrisons that were slowly bleeding the Allied armies dry. Kenney knew something had to change. The rulebook was failing. The first domino was teetering on the brink. He needed a new way to fight, a new weapon, a new doctrine. And he needed it now, before the entire campaign collapsed under the weight of this single, infuriating problem. How do you sink a moving ship from the air? Every revolution begins with a whisper, a radical idea that challenges the established order. For General Kenney, that whisper came from the ghost of a dead pilot. Major William Benn of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron was a man who had seen the failure of high-altitude bombing firsthand and decided to do something about it. In the dead of night over the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul in October 1942, Ben had tried something insane. He took his B-17 Flying Fortress, a bomber designed to operate at 5 miles high, and pushed its nose down towards the waves, leveling off just a few hundred feet above the dark water. Approaching an enemy ship at high speed, he didn't drop his bombs. He threw them. Releasing them with delayed action fuses, he watched them hit the water, and just like flat stones skipped across a pond, bounce across the surface directly into the side of the target. It was called skip bombing. It was terrifying, unorthodox, and it worked. Ben had sunk ships. He had found a potential answer to Kenney's problem. But the whisper was almost silenced before it could become a roar. On January 18, 1943, Major Ben's aircraft vanished over New Guinea. He died before he could perfect the technique for large-scale operations, before he could write the new doctrine, before he could train others in this dark art. The idea was there, a tantalizing proof of concept. But it was an orphan, a dangerous trick performed by a dead man. To turn this rogue tactic into a reliable weapons system would require more than a brave pilot. It would require an engineer, a man who could physically reshape the tools of war. That man arrived at Kenney's headquarters like a force of nature. Major Paul Gunn, known to everyone as Pappy, was a former naval aviator and airline manager whose wife and 4 children were trapped behind enemy lines in the Philippines. This personal tragedy had forged in him a white-hot, singular focus to kill as many of the enemy as possible, as quickly as possible. Gunn combined this burning rage with a savant-like mechanical genius. He could look at an airplane not as it was, but as it could be. When Kenny presented him with the problem, Gunn didn't just see a tactical challenge. He saw a design flaw in the American bomber itself. The B-25 Mitchell was a fine medium bomber, but for high-altitude work. For low-level attack, it was vulnerable and poorly armed for a head-on assault. The Bombardier, sitting in the glass nose, was a passenger on a low-level run. The plane's defensive guns pointed up, back, and to the sides, but its forward-facing armament was pathetic. Working in the primitive, sweltering maintenance depots of Port Moresby, with scavenged parts and sheer ingenuity, Pappy Gunn began to perform surgery. He took the B-25 and ripped out its soul. The Bombardier's position, with its sacred Norden bomb sight, was unceremoniously discarded. In its place, Gunn and his team mounted a staggering array of forward-firing firepower. First, 4 50-caliber machine guns. Then, they added more in blisters on the sides of the fuselage. Soon, they were packing 8, 10, even 12 heavy machine guns, all wired to a single trigger on the pilot's control column. The result was a monster, a flying battleship that bore little resemblance to the machine that had rolled off the factory line in California. Gunn had created the B-25 Commerce Destroyer. Its purpose was brutally simple. On a low-level attack run, the pilot no longer needed a bombardier. He was the bombardier. The entire aircraft was now the gun sight. He would aim the nose of the plane at the enemy ship and unleash a torrent of fire that could sweep the decks clear of anti-aircraft gunners, shred the superstructure, and sow chaos and terror. This suppressive fire wasn't just a bonus. It was the key that unlocked the whole tactic. It would keep the crew alive long enough to get in close, to that magic range where they could skip their bombs into the hull with unerring accuracy. The creation of Pappy Gunn's gunship was the second domino. It was a physical manifestation of Kenny's rejection of doctrine. It shattered the philosophy that a bomber was a high-altitude platform for a bomb site. This new machine was a low-altitude assault weapon, a brawler meant to get down in the muck and fight. But a weapon, no matter how brilliant, is just inert metal without a warrior trained and willing to wield it. Kenny had the theory from a ghost and the tool from a vengeful genius. Now, he needed a man who could lead others into the mouth of hell and make them believe they could come back. That man was Major Edward Ed Lana, a barrel-chested, hard-charging pilot who commanded the 90th Bombardment Squadron. Lana was the embodiment of aggressive leadership. He wore his service cap pushed back on his head with a casual defiance and was known amongst his men for a simple, unbreakable code. He would never order them to fly a mission he wasn't willing to lead himself. When General Kenny showed him Pappy Gunn's modified B-25 and explained the concept of mast-height, skip-bombing attacks, Lana's response was immediate and without hesitation. He would train his men, and they would not miss. The training ground was a ghostly landmark in Port Moresby Harbor, the wreck of the SS Pruth, a British steamer that had run aground on a reef 2 decades earlier. Its rusting hulk, sitting upright in the water, became the perfect, patient target. Day after day, through January and February of 1943, the skies over the harbor thundered with the sound of Wright Cyclone engines. Lana drove his squadron, the Jolly Rogers, relentlessly. They practiced diving from a few thousand feet, leveling out at a terrifying 200 feet above the waves and screaming towards the wreck. There was no Norden bomb sight anymore. Pilots learned to use a simple grease pencil mark on their windscreen as a crude aiming point. The co-pilot would call out the rapidly shrinking range. At the last possible second, the bombs would be released, skipping across the water toward the Pruth. Each pilot dropped 30 to 40 practice bombs, honing the split-second timing, the feel for altitude and speed that could not be taught from a manual. This was not safe. It was inherently, profoundly dangerous. Flying a multi-ton bomber at over 200 miles per hour, just a few dozen yards above the water, leaves zero margin for error. A moment's inattention, a slight downdraft, a mechanical failure. Any of these meant instant, catastrophic impact with the sea. The danger was made brutally real when one crew, misjudging their approach, struck the mast of the Pruth. The B-25 cartwheeled into the water and exploded, killing all aboard. The squadron paused, held a funeral for their fallen comrades, and the very next day, they were back in the air, practicing again. Lana knew what was at stake. He knew that the abstract debates over doctrine in Washington meant nothing to the infantrymen dying in the New Guinea mud. He understood that every Japanese convoy that got through was a failure measured in Allied blood. His relentless, borderline brutal training was forging a new kind of aircrew. He was stripping away their reliance on high-altitude safety and technology and replacing it with raw nerve, instinct, and a deadly, intimate familiarity with their new weapon. By the end of February, Lana reported back to Kenny. His boys, he said, were now a cocky gang who believed they could hit anything. They were ready. The third domino had fallen. The theory had become a weapon, and the weapon now had a trained, honed, and fearless warrior class ready to wield it. All they needed was a target. Intelligence provided it. Allied codebreakers working silently miles away intercepted and decrypted Japanese naval messages. A major convoy was assembling in the port of Rabaul. Its destination, Lae, New Guinea. Its cargo, 6,900 fresh troops and supplies for the Japanese front lines. Its departure, the night of February 28th, 1943. The pieces were in place. The trap was set. On the morning of March 3rd, the call came. Reconnaissance planes had located the convoy. It was steaming through the Bismarck Sea, exactly where Allied planners predicted it would be. In the pre-dawn briefing room at Port Moresby, Lana laid out the plan. It would be a symphony of destruction, conducted across multiple altitudes. Heavy B-17 flying fortresses would strike first, from a conventional medium altitude of 5,000 to 7,000 feet. Their purpose was not necessarily to sink ships, but to act as a diversion, to scatter the convoy's tight defensive formation and force the Japanese destroyers into evasive maneuvers. Then, the real attack would begin. 13 Beaufighters from the Royal Australian Air Force would come in at wave-top level. These twin-engine fighters, armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, were the can openers. Their job was to strafe the ships, suppressing anti-aircraft fire, killing gun crews, and creating chaos on the decks. And into that chaos would come Lana and his B-25s, followed by A-20 Havoc light bombers, all attacking at 200 feet. Lana's orders were brutally direct. Find your target. Come in fast and low. Use your guns to clear the decks. Skip your bombs into the hull. Get out fast. At 8:55 a.m., the final confirmation came. Lana turned to his squadron. Cape Ward Hunt 0930, he shouted. Let's go. The roar of engines filled the tropical air. One by one, the modified B-25s, heavy with fuel and bombs, lifted off the runway and formed up over the brilliant blue water. This was the autopsy of an old idea. the moment of truth. For 15 minutes, the skies over the Bismarck Sea would become a laboratory. And the hypothesis being tested was whether courage and innovation could truly rewrite the laws of war. At precisely 10 a.m., the first act began. The B-17s commenced their bombing runs from 7,000 feet. From the decks of the Japanese ships, it was a familiar sight. The sky blossomed with the black puffs of flak. Tracers arced upwards. Captains skillfully maneuvered their vessels. A few bombs found their mark, hitting a transport which began to list. But most fell harmlessly into the sea. For the Japanese commanders, this was conventional bombing. This they could handle. Then came the Hornets. The Australian bowfighters arrived like a phantom menace, skimming the wave tops at over 300 miles per hour. Japanese gunners, trained to track the slow, high-altitude bombers, were caught completely off guard by these targets moving horizontally at blistering speed. Before they could adjust their aim, the bowfighters opened fire. Cannon shells ripped through steel superstructures. Heavy machine gun fire swept across the decks like a scythe. The disciplined formations of the convoy began to break. Destroyers, mistaking the low-flying planes for torpedo bombers, turned bow on to present a smaller target. A standard, but in this case fatal defensive maneuver. In doing so, they exposed the vulnerable transports they were meant to protect. The stage was set. Into this maelstrom of confusion and smoke came Ed Lana and his wolves. He spotted his target, a large destroyer, and pushed the nose of his B-25 down, leveling off at 200 feet. The ocean surface became a high-speed blur just beneath his wheels. The bomber surged to 225 miles per hour. At 1,200 yards, he squeezed the trigger. The nose of his B-25 erupted. 8 50-caliber machine guns unleashed a devastating stream of fire. Half-inch slugs hammered into the destroyer. Japanese sailors on deck were cut down. Gun emplacements exploded. The ship's bridge was shattered. Lana held his course, rock steady, flying directly into the teeth of the enemy's return fire, his plane acting as a giant sight. The grease pencil mark on his windscreen settled on the destroyer's waterline. 200 yards, his co-pilot yelled. 100! At the perfect moment, the bombardier toggled the release. 2 500-pound bombs, fitted with 5-second delay fuses, dropped away. They hit the water, but didn't explode. Carried by their momentum, they skipped like colossal stones. The first bomb bounced once and slammed into the destroyer's hull right at the waterline. The second followed, skipping directly underneath the vessel. Lana hauled back on the control column, and the B-25 roared over the destroyer's mast with only feet to spare. As they passed, his waist gunners raked the decks with continuous fire. 5 seconds later, a quarter-mile away, the bombs detonated. The first blew a massive hole in the ship's side. The second, exploding directly beneath the keel, created a colossal bubble of gas that lifted the destroyer out of the water and broke its back. The ship began to founder almost immediately. All around the convoy, the scene was repeating with methodical, terrifying precision. Lieutenant Charles Howe's bombs skipped into a transport. Captain John Henneby's tracers walked across another ship's superstructure before his bombs found their mark. Within minutes, the B-25s were followed by the A-20 Havocs, executing the same deadly, low-level attacks. The Japanese response was overwhelmed. The sheer violence and speed of the multi-pronged assault was something they had never conceived of. Gunners who tried to fight back were shredded by the B-25's suppressive fire. Captains watched, helpless, as bombs they could not evade skipped inexorably towards their hulls. By 10:15 a.m., just 15 minutes after the main attack began, the battle was effectively over. The Bismarck Sea was a junkyard of burning, sinking steel. All 8 transport ships had been hit and were either going down or were hopelessly ablaze. 3 of the 8 Guardian destroyers were crippled or sinking. The results were not just a victory, they were an annihilation. The B-17s, using the old high-altitude method, had achieved a hit rate of around 3%. The B-25s and A-20s, using the suicidal low-altitude technique, achieved a staggering hit rate of over 50%. Out of 37 bombs dropped by the B-25s, 17 were direct hits. Ed Lana and his cocky gang had not missed. The ripple effect of those 15 minutes washed over the entire Pacific War. The immediate aftermath was grim and controversial. Orders came down to patrol the wreckage and strafe the survivors. The logic was cold and brutal. Every Japanese soldier killed in the water was one less that Allied infantry would have to face in the jungle. In the context of the Pacific's no-quarter fighting, where Japanese forces rarely surrendered and were known to commit atrocities like shooting at bailed-out airmen, commanders saw it as a military necessity. But for the pilots tasked with the job, it was a haunting mission. A moral stain on a brilliant victory that many would carry for the rest of their lives. Tactically, the ripple effect was a tidal wave. Skip bombing was no longer a rogue experiment. It was the new standard. Squadrons across the Pacific began modifying their bombers into Pappy gun-style gunships. Japanese naval commanders, who once felt secure behind destroyer screens, now lived in dread of the low-level commerce destroyers. Their entire convoy system, the logistical lifeblood of their island empire, was rendered obsolete wherever Allied land-based air power could reach. Strategically, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a death sentence for the Japanese forces in New Guinea. After witnessing the wholesale slaughter of the Leh convoy, the Japanese Imperial High Command made no further large-scale attempts to reinforce the island by sea. The garrisons were cut off, isolated, and left to wither on the vine. General MacArthur's island-hopping campaign, which depended on controlling the sea lanes, was now possible. The strategic map of the Southwest Pacific had been irrevocably redrawn. The 4th domino had fallen, and its impact crushed Japan's ambitions in the region. Victory in war is always paid for with a human price. For Major Ed Lana, the architect of the Bismarck Sea triumph, that price would be paid not in the heat of combat, but in a cruel twist of fate. On April 30th, 1943, less than 2 months after his historic mission, Lana was coming in to land at an airfield. He performed his signature maneuver, a spectacular, aggressive dive towards the runway, followed by a sharp pull-up. He'd done it dozens of times. But on this day, his B-25 was overloaded with fuel, passengers, and bombs. As he pulled back on the column, the heavy bomber stalled. It entered a flat spin and crashed, exploding on impact. There were no survivors. The man who had flown through a wall of anti-aircraft fire at 200 feet and survived died in a moment of peacetime bravado. He was buried at Port Moresby, his legend secured by the 15 minutes of combat that changed naval warfare forever. His legacy, however, was immortal. The techniques he perfected and the squadron he trained, now under the command of his wingman John Hennebrey, went on to sink dozens more Japanese ships. Pappy Gunn's B-25 gunship became one of the most versatile and feared aircraft of the war, its design principles influencing attack aircraft for decades to come. And General George Kenney's willingness to throw out the rulebook became a model for air power employment, demonstrating that innovation and adaptation, driven by necessity, are the ultimate force multipliers. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was more than just a battle. It was a paradigm shift. It stands as a timeless lesson that military doctrine, no matter how revered, is not sacred scripture. It is a tool, and when that tool fails, it must be discarded and a new one forged. The story is a testament to a perfect synergy of leadership, the strategic visionary in Kenny who identified the problem and empowered his subordinates, the mad genius in Pappy Gunn who built the solution with his bare hands, and the warrior leader in Ed Lana who perfected its use and led the charge. It proved that the most complex problems are sometimes solved with the most brutally direct solutions. The United States had invested millions in a high-altitude bomb site of miraculous complexity, only to find that the war in the Pacific was won by men with grease pencil marks on their windscreens, flying so low they could taste the salt spray. It is a stark reminder that technology is only as effective as the tactics and the people who employ it. The echoes of those 15 minutes over the Pacific in March 1943 still resonate today. They serve as a powerful case study in military innovation, combined arms warfare, and the critical importance of challenging assumptions. The forbidden tactic became the standard. The impossible mission became the template for victory. And the names of the men who fought there, though fading into history, left behind a lesson written in fire and steel, that sometimes, to win a war, you first have to win the war against your own ideas. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of World War II's most pivotal and innovative battles. The story of the Bismarck Sea is a powerful example of how history is shaped, not by inevitability, but by the choices of individuals who dare to think differently. If you find these stories of historical ingenuity as compelling as we do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more content. And we want to hear from you. What other examples of game-changing tactical innovations from history should we cover next? Let us know in the comments below.